The weight of the $200 bottle of wine and the organic farm-raised turkey I carried felt heavier with each step toward my parents' front door. It was Thanksgiving, a day I, as a chef, should have loved, but I knew what was waiting inside wasn't warmth, it was expectation. My father, Michael, once a proud builder, now built only walls of resentment, while my brother, Ryan, saw me not as his sister, but as his next angel investor. They thought they had me all figured out, just another appliance in the house they could draw from. They were wrong. This was the Thanksgiving where I served them a dish they never saw coming, the consequences of their own actions. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Abigail. The 3-hour drive north from the city always gave me too much time to think. I watched the golden and crimson hues of the autumn landscape blur past the windows of the sleek, dark sedan, a car that represented years of grueling 16-hour days. A car they didn't even know I'd finally paid off for them last spring. Each mile closer to my childhood home felt like a step backward in time, shedding the confident, respected chef I was in the city to become the quiet, accommodating daughter I was expected to be here. I remembered past Thanksgivings, the air thick with the same unspoken tensions, the same cycle of my father's brooding silence and my brother's grandiose pronouncements about futures that never arrived. Pulling into the familiar gravel driveway, I saw the house I grew up in, nestled among tall oak trees. It was still beautiful, but a closer look revealed the subtle signs of neglect. The white paint on the window frames was peeling slightly, and the grand oak in the front yard seemed to droop a little, tired from holding its heavy branches aloft for so many years. It was a house built on my father's past successes, a monument to a pride that had long since curdled into bitterness, now secretly maintained by my current triumphs. I gathered the groceries, balancing the bags as I walked inside. The familiar smell of old wood, dusty books, and my mother's lavender air freshener greeted me like a ghost from a life I no longer lived. "I'm here," I called out, my voice sounding foreign in the quiet hall. My mother, Susan, emerged from the den. She was still elegant, but a permanent look of worry had etched fine lines around her eyes. She gave me a quick, brittle hug, her hands barely touching my back before her eyes landed on the overflowing grocery bags. "Oh, Abigail, you shouldn't have," she said, her tone a practiced blend of gratitude and gentle reprimand that suggested I absolutely should have. I followed her into the kitchen and found her pulling a store-bought, frozen pumpkin pie from the freezer, its cardboard box a stark contrast to the fresh pumpkins and spice jars I'd brought. "I always prefer the traditional flavors, she added, placing it on the counter. It was a subtle but clear dismissal of the gourmet ingredients I'd sourced from the city's best markets, a reminder that my world and my tastes were not welcome here. I unpacked my things in silence, placing the expensive cheese, the artisan bread, and the fresh cranberries on the worn countertop she'd refused to let me replace last year. My father was in his usual throne, a worn brown leather armchair positioned squarely in front of the financial news network. He grunted a hello without turning his head, his face tight with a familiar resentment as the stock market ticker crawled across the screen. I saw a segment highlighting a young tech entrepreneur, and my father's jaw tightened. Every success story that wasn't his own, especially a young one, felt like a personal insult, a judgment on the catastrophic business decision that had cost him everything 3 years ago. My brother, Ryan, was lounging on the sofa, scrolling lazily through his phone. He looked up, a bright, practiced smile instantly appearing on his face. "Abby, great to see you. Just finalizing the pitch deck for Arrow Brew. It's going to completely disrupt the artisanal coffee space." He gestured with a hand adorned with a designer watch. a watch I knew for a fact had been paid for by the last loan I had given him for a coding boot camp he never finished. His language was a stream of buzzwords he'd picked up from podcasts, empty phrases meant to signify a genius he didn't possess. I forced a smile and set about my work in the kitchen, the space that was supposed to be my domain, my comfort zone, but here, it felt like a service station. I started prepping the vegetables, the rhythmic, calming chop of my chef's knife on the cutting board, a small anchor in the rising tension of the house. No one offered to help. My mother was busy arranging decorative gourds on the mantelpiece. My father was absorbed in his silent rage at the television, and Ryan was practicing his elevator pitch under his breath. I was the designated chef, the provider, the silent, efficient engine that made their lives run smoothly. As I was rubbing the turkey with herbs and butter, I stepped onto the back porch for a breath of crisp November air. The screen door creaked behind me. That's when I heard my father's voice, low and confidential, coming from the side of the house where he was on the phone with his brother, my Uncle Steve. No, Abigail is just a cook. Yeah, she makes a good living, a comfortable one. But Ryan, he's the one with the vision. He has the mind for business, the ambition to rebuild this family's name. He just needs the right backing. The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. Just a cook. After all the years of sacrifice, the brutal hours in hostile kitchens, the Michelin star nominations, the magazine features that called me a culinary innovator. To my own father, I was still just a cook, a reliable utility. I retreated back into the kitchen, my hands miraculously steady, but my heart a cold, hard knot in my chest. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of polite, meaningless chatter. I moved around the kitchen on autopilot, the delicious, comforting smells of roasting turkey, sage, and garlic mashed potatoes filling a house that felt emotionally hollow. Dinner was served at 4 o'clock. The table was set with the good china, a relic from a more prosperous time, its gold trim slightly faded. My father sat at the head of the table and began to carve the golden brown turkey I had bought and cooked, his movements practiced and authoritative. As he served the plates, he launched into a story about a construction project from 15 years ago, a tale of his own brilliance and foresight. My mother listened with rapt attention, as if hearing it for the first time. She then recounted stories of Ryan's supposed genius as a child, how he'd built a lemonade stand that was practically a franchise. They spoke of the past and a fantasy future, carefully avoiding the uncomfortable present. They barely acknowledged the prestigious culinary award I had received last month, the one that had been the biggest achievement of my career. "Oh, that's nice, dear," my mother had said when I told her, before immediately changing the subject. "They're about to close a huge round of seed funding," my father would say about Ryan's latest venture, a statement with no basis in reality, a fiction they had all agreed to believe. Then, as if on cue, Ryan cleared his throat, a theatrical gesture to command attention. He pulled out his iPad, the screen glowing in the dim dining room light. "So, speaking of the future," he began, launching into a slick presentation for Aero Brew. It was a flashy, nonsensical idea about delivering single origin. Pour-over coffee to office windows via drone. He finished his pitch, his eyes shining with unearned confidence, and looked directly at me. "All I need to get the prototype fleet off the ground is a small seed investment. $50,000. The entire table went silent. Every eye turned to me. It wasn't a question, it was an expectation. I placed my fork down gently, the tines clicking softly against the china. The silence in the room grew heavier with each passing second, thick with the weight of 3 years of financial support. I looked at my brother, at the hopeful, entitled glint in his eyes. I looked at my parents, their faces a mixture of anticipation and parental pressure. I took a slow sip of wine. "Ryan," I began, my voice even and surprisingly calm, "I believe in your passion. You know I do. But I simply can't right now. The restaurant needs all available capital for a critical expansion I've been planning for over a year." My father's fork clattered onto his plate. He stared at me, his face slowly turning a deep, dangerous shade of red. He pushed his chair back from the table with a loud scrape and stood up, his large frame looming over all of us. "An expansion for your little kitchen," he boomed, his voice echoing in the sudden, sharp silence. "This family is trying to rebuild an empire from the ashes, and you're worried about your pots and pans. We raised you. We fed you. We gave you a roof over your head. If money has made you so selfish that you can't support your own blood, then there is no place for you at this table. Get out." His words hung in the air, sharper than any knife I owned. Get out. No one moved. No one spoke in my defense. My mother just stared at her plate, her knuckles white as she gripped her napkin, refusing to meet my eyes. Ryan looked shocked for a moment, before his expression hardened into a look of pure resentment. I slowly folded my own napkin, my movements feeling strangely detached, as if I were watching myself in a movie. I stood up, my chair making no sound on the thick dining room rug. I looked at my father, at the man whose approval I had spent my entire life chasing, and I felt nothing but a profound aching emptiness. I walked out of the dining room, collected my purse and my coat from the hall, and left the house without a single word. The cold night air was a shock to my system as I walked to my car. My hands were trembling, not from sadness, but from a surge of adrenaline and a strange, terrifying clarity. Before I even started the engine, my phone buzzed, a text from Ryan. "Way to ruin Thanksgiving. Abby, always have to make it about you." I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, and drove away into the darkness, leaving the warm, deceptive glow of the house I had saved from foreclosure behind me. The drive home was a blur of highway lights and shadows. I didn't cry. The tears felt frozen inside me, replaced by a cold, hard resolve that solidified with every mile that separated me from them. When I finally walked into my own apartment, the immense, peaceful quiet felt like a blessing. It was a space that was entirely mine, a reflection of my taste, built by my success, filled with my own choices. There was no judgment here, no unspoken expectations, no ghosts of past failures. My phone started buzzing relentlessly on the kitchen island, a string of missed calls from my mother, voicemails filled with escalating panic. "Abigail, how could you embarrass your father like that? Then, please call us. You know how he gets. We need to talk this through." And finally, the real reason, stripped of all pretense. "Abigail, the mortgage payment is due next week. How are we supposed to pay it without your help?" I poured myself a glass of wine, a cheap but cheerful bottle from my own rack, and it tasted infinitely better than the expensive vintage I had left half-finished on their table. The manipulation was so transparent, so predictable. It was almost insulting. This was never about family. It was about finance. My resolve hardened into steel. I walked over to the large abstract painting hanging in my living room, lifted it from its hook, and revealed the small flush-mounted safe hidden in the wall behind it. In the side, there was no cash, only a thick leather-bound folder. For the past 3 years, I hadn't just been helping out. On the stern advice of my lawyer, Mr. Davies, I had done things by the book. He had warned me from the beginning. "Generosity without boundaries is a trap. Abigail," he'd said. So, I formed a limited liability company, a shell corporation with a generic name. Through that company, my lawyer had negotiated the purchase of my father's outstanding business debt from the bank after his bankruptcy. That included the primary mortgage on their home. They had been told it was a debt restructuring program from the bank. They never read the fine print on the documents that listed a new, obscure holding company as the owner of the note. They were no longer paying the bank. They were paying their mortgage to me. Every single loan I gave Ryan, every utility bill I covered, was documented with legally binding promissory notes they had signed without a second thought, believing it was just a formality for my tax records. My phone rang again, pulling me from my thoughts. This time it was my father. His voice was strained, an awkward mix of patriarchal authority and raw desperation. "We need to talk," he said, skipping any greeting. "You need to come back and apologize. Your mother is a complete wreck because of your selfishness. I listened to him, his words about family duty and responsibility washing over me, hollow and meaningless. All I could think about were the signed, notarized documents in the folder on my coffee table. The game was over. I just had to be brave enough to finally end it. The next 2 days were a relentless storm of guilt-tripping texts and angry voicemails. My mother sent me a message that read, "Your father is having chest pains from all the stress. He's resting now, but the doctor is very worried. I hope you're happy." For a split second, a cold spear of panic seized me. I almost grabbed my keys, ready to drive back, ready to give in and beg for forgiveness. But then, my intuition, honed by years of their subtle and overt manipulations, kicked in. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding, and calmly called the main switchboard at the local hospital. The receptionist was polite and efficient. She confirmed that no patient named Michael had been admitted in the last 48 hours. The lie was so blatant, so cruel. It severed the very last thread of sentimental obligation I felt. It was the final, brutal push I needed. On Saturday evening, my restaurant, Aperture, was alive. The low hum of happy conversation, the clinking of glasses, the warm glow of the bespoke lighting. It was my sanctuary, the world I had built from nothing. I was at my best table near the window, discussing a potential feature story with a major food critic, when they walked in. My father, looking perfectly healthy and indignant, led the charge, flanked by my mother, her face a mask of sorrowful accusation, and Ryan, who looked both arrogant and aggrieved. They marched through the crowded dining room and stopped directly at my table, their presence immediately sucking the warmth out of the air. "We need to talk about your responsibilities," my father announced, his voice loud enough to turn heads and create a ripple of silence around us. He intended to make a scene, to leverage public shame to force me into submission in my own territory. But I was ready. I had anticipated this. I gave a subtle nod to a man sitting quietly at the bar, nursing a glass of water. It was my lawyer, Mr. Davies. He stood up, calm and immaculately professional, and walked over with his leather briefcase. He placed it on the table and, with a quiet, definitive click, opened it. He handed my father a thick, professionally bound set of documents. My father snatched them, a confused and angry look on his face. He started to read the first page, his brow furrowed. I watched as the color drained from his face, replaced by a sickly, pale shock. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with disbelief and dawning horror. The document was not a proposal for repayment. It was a formal notice of eviction, legally ordering them to vacate the property within 30 days for non-payment of rent to the legal owner AM Solutions, LLC. "What is this? Who is AM Solutions?" he whispered, his voice trembling and barely audible. I leaned forward, my voice low but clear enough for the critic and the surrounding tables to hear every single deliberate word. "I am. You were right, Dad. Paying the bills doesn't make me family." I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle in the stunned silence. "It makes me your landlord." A wave of shocked silence, followed by hushed whispers, rippled through the restaurant. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a scream. Ryan just stared, his jaw hanging open, the smugness completely wiped from his face. The public humiliation, the sheer undeniable reality of the situation, had shattered their entire world in an instant. "Mister." Davies then calmly presented Ryan with another file containing pristine copies of every loan agreement he had so casually signed, along with a formal, legally binding demand for repayment. They stood there, utterly defeated, exposed and powerless in the middle of the thriving business they had once dismissed as just a kitchen. They turned and walked out, not with anger, but with the heavy, shuffling steps of people whose reality had been completely and irrevocably dismantled. In the weeks that followed, the silence from them was absolute, broken only by a few frantic, incoherent messages from their newly hired small-town lawyer, which Mr. Davies handled with swift, surgical precision. I proceeded with the eviction. They were forced to sell off most of their remaining assets at an estate sale and move into a small 2-bedroom rental apartment on the other side of town. Ryan, for the first time in his adult life, had to get a real job, working early morning shifts as a barista at a corporate coffee chain, a bitter irony that wasn't lost on me. The proceeds from the sale of the house went directly to my company, settling their enormous debts to me. I instructed Mr. Davies to place the remaining amount, a modest sum, into a tightly controlled trust for their future emergency medical needs. It was an act of finality, not of forgiveness. It was the closing of a ledger, the end of a transaction. Months passed. The seasons changed. I poured my energy into my work. I expanded the restaurant, opened a small bakery next door, and earned more accolades. The noise of my success began to drown out the silence from my family. There were days, late at night, when that silence felt like a hollow ache, a phantom limb of what a family was supposed to be. But most days, it felt like peace. It was the quiet, clean air after a suffocating, lifelong storm. I had learned that cutting away a toxic part of your life, even if it's the part that is supposed to love you, isn't an act of cruelty. It's an act of survival. 1 year later, on Thanksgiving Day, I didn't drive 3 hours to my childhood home. Instead, I closed my restaurant to the public and hosted a dinner. The long tables were filled with my staff, my closest friends, and families from the local homeless shelter, the family I had chosen, the community I had built. The room was filled with genuine laughter and warmth, a vibrant, joyful connection that money could never buy and obligation could never create. Midway through the dinner, as I was sharing a story with my sous chef, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in a year, Michael. I looked at the call for a long moment, the noise and laughter of the party fading into a distant background hum. There was no anger, no sadness, not even a flicker of curiosity. There was just a quiet sense of closure. I pressed the button on the side of the phone, silencing the call forever. I put it back in my pocket, picked up my wine glass, and turned back to the smiling faces around me. Raising my glass in a toast, I was finally home.